Welcome to yet another installment of AP Euro KO Style. All right, in this episode, we're going to be covering and supplementing material in regards to Jackson J. Spielvogel's Western Civilization, pages 570 to 577. In this segment, and in this episode, we're going to cover the early phases of the actual French Revolution, up to and not including the radical phase or the radical revolution, which starts on page 577. Now, again, this episode will cover key concept 2.14b of the new curriculum, and basically that is a summary of that is the first or liberal phase of the French Revolution established a constitutional monarchy, increased popular participation, nationalized the Catholic Church, and abolished hereditary rights or privileges. Now, as you can see here on this slide, this particular section also covers a lot of the thematic learning objectives, and again, we're not going to memorize these, but if you kind of look over these, you could pause the video and just kind of get your mind focused on what are the themes that are the most important, according to the College Board, to take out of this particular section. And of course, our focus is going to be what were the main events of the French Revolution, really between 1789 and 1799, and what role did each of the following play in the French Revolution: lawyers, peasants, women, clergy, Jacobins, and the sans-culottes. All right, now, in the last installment, we left off with the monarchy summoning the Estates General for the first time in almost 175 years. The king was looking for a solution, as we know, to the impending financial crisis, and that was about it. It was just to solve the financial crisis, figure out a reform, figure out some kind of solution to the financial crisis that was plaguing France. It really had no long-term vision, especially long-term major reforms. They didn't have that in mind. They didn't really call the Estates General to change the status quo. Try to change the status quo. What they were basically trying to do is status quo with a little bit of reform. Now, more than likely, many of the delegates from the three estates did not foresee the drastic changes that the next few years would bring, yet unforeseen actions and reactions to what was about to happen at Versailles would change, in fact, France and the rest of Europe and the world in many, many, many ways. Now, as you see here, this slide, Estates General to a National Assembly. What is the Estates General? Well, we know the ancient feudal body of the Estates General was supposed to represent the three estates of the old regime in France. Now, as they called the Estates General, election fever swept over France between 1788 and 89 as representatives were elected for the first time. The king declared that the Estates General should consist of 300 representatives of the clergy, 300 from the nobility, and 600, and this is important, 600 representatives from the Third Estate. The fact that the Third Estate had 600 was kind of a concession by Louis, an olive branch of sorts, recognizing, hey, you have the most people in the country, so what we're going to do is we're going to give you the most delegates. Now, elections for the Estates General took place during a time when people were pretty frustrated. This was escalated by a bad harvest economic crisis in 1788. In fact, France was experiencing at this particular time, one of the worst depressions that they had experienced in years. People were miserable. All right, pamphlets started to be published by the hundreds, by the thousands, expressing the aspirations and the discontent of a wide variety of people from the populace of France. During the electoral process, some of the reform-minded delegates prepared the Cahier de Doléances, which is in your textbook, and a list of grievances, and each state was instructed to compile a list of these quote-unquote suggestions or complaints and grievances, and they were going to bring those to the Estates General and present them to the king. What's this? It says the Third Estate cheated? Well, in May of 1789, in the first formal meeting, Louis XVI ordered the estates to meet separately and vote by order, meaning vote by each separate estate. Now, this was a problem, and the Third Estate felt cheated. They knew that the first two states would indefinitely vote against the Third Estate to protect their privileged status. The fact that each order would have one vote collectively meant that no matter what, the First and Second Estate would always win. Again, the fact that those two orders only represented roughly 3% of the total population infuriated the majority in France, and especially the members of the Third Estate in the Estates General. The third demanded double representation, hoping that the votes would be counted per deputy, per representative, and not in the estate order. All right. Now, the total number of voters in the assembly was about 1,000. So, since there were far more delegates from the Third Estate's plan would give them the majority. The king refused to grant their request. All right. And this is known as the voting by order versus voting by head. And the Third Estate refused to budge. And they, along with a handful of liberal-minded members of the First and Second Estates, declared themselves a quote-unquote, the big term here now, National Assembly. And what they did was they invited other members to join them. Abbé Sieyès. What is the Third Estate? One of the representatives, Abbé Sieyès, had published and distributed a pamphlet called What is the Third Estate? And what he declared and claimed is that the Third Estate should technically rule France. He stated that the nobility should be abolished, and he believed that the Third Estate represented the vast majority of French society. So that's why he said, what is the Third Estate? Everything. You know, in his writing, he invoked Rousseau's social contract and the concept of general will. And believe it or not, it wasn't really popular at this particular time. It was just a pamphlet. Most people wanted to make changes within the existing framework of government and did still respect the authority of the king. Many thought Sieyès was a bit over the top. But ladies and gentlemen, they hadn't seen anything yet. So on June 20th, 1789, the Third Estate delegates arrived to its designated meeting hall, as depicted here in this painting, and they found themselves locked out. All right, they're locked out of their assembly room, and they held a meeting in a nearby indoor tennis court and took the infamous tennis court oath, which they swore not to disband until France had a constitution. So this so-called National Assembly is going to become a constitutional assembly. And here again, you can see this painting. I have some captions on it, but it's depicted. It's painted by Jacques-Louis David, the neoclassical artist that we've covered earlier in the year, and he dramatized this famous tennis court oath. All right, and again, it's very important for you to recognize that. I had a little fun with it, and I put my depictions of what is kind of being said here, and there are some interesting characters in this painting. I'm not sure if you can see it with this recording, but you know, you got one guy saying the field goal, it's good, whispering here, hey dude, the French monarchy is French toast. And then dude, I think the Pope is going to give me 10 down low right here, and you know, he's just going to go along with it. This guy's raising the roof. And then this guy's so happy, and I don't know if you can see this, he's going to kiss a guy with the Black Death. And these people thought it was a tennis match, so they're ready to go. And then just wondering, what if they weren't really locked out by the king? What if somebody like a janitor, custodian, was like, just got hung over or just forgot to open the room? And this whole thing was just, you know, started by just some forgetfulness. But anyway, some fun stuff there when you think about it. So between June 20th and June 23rd, 1789, there was a standoff. The king met with all three estates and commanded them to meet separately and vote in the traditional manner. But the Third Estate refused, as we said, and they adjourned their meeting. Now again, 3 days later, Louis gives in. The three would meet together and vote by head. So this was considered a pretty drastic triumph for the Third Estate. And it was a pretty big accomplishment, being that technically the Third Estate had no legal right to act as a National Assembly as they did. This triumph, mainly organized by lawyers in the Third Estate, was soon in jeopardy because the king started to side with the first two estates and threatened to dissolve the Estates General. And it was rumored that Louis would use force, and it appeared that reform would not last, and the revolution that had started was doomed. But not so fast, my friends. Enter into the equation, not the lawyers, okay, but the commoners, the common people, the Parisians, the peasants, and they start to get in on the revolutionary spirit. You see, poor Harvest as we said, had led to economic hardship for both groups. And the National Assembly was seen as a ray of hope for reform, that people would actually help these people. So the commoners weren't about to let their interests go unhurt. These common folk would wage a war that even the most reform-minded members of the Third Estate didn't see coming. Riots and uprisings in Paris led to the king to call troops from the frontier garrisons back to Versailles to disperse the assembly. Parisians decided to counter this threat of force, well, with force. So on July 14th, 1789, you have the storming of the Bastille. All right, an old prison and a symbol of the old regime and the arbitrary power or arbitrary rule of the Bourbons. The Bastille was stormed because there was a rumor of guns and ammunitions that were in fact stored there. While the prison only contained about 7 prisoners at the time when it was stormed, its fall was the flashpoint, if you will, of the French Revolution. Over 8,000 people gathered at the gates before the stalemate erupted into total chaos. And later, when the chaos settled, the governor of the prison, the guy that was in charge, who peacefully surrendered to the mob, was beheaded. And then you start this new trend, and you behead people and then parade them around the streets on a pike. Nice touch. So the storming of the Bastille, did it work? Well, the popular Jacques Necker was brought back to power, and the hero of the American Revolution, the Marquis de Lafayette, became the commander of the newly created National Guard, a citizens' militia not run by the crown to protect the citizens' welfare. Later, George Washington, this is the little U.S. flavor, later George Washington was presented a key to the Bastille by his old pal Lafayette. And if you visited his home in Mount Vernon, outside of Washington, D.C., the key is actually on the wall by the stairwell that leads to his bedroom. All right. The other thing that happened here was that the red, white, and blue tricolor flag of the French Revolution was adopted. And as the revolution intensified, many aristocrats, or the nobility, started to flee France. They emigrated, so your book, and a lot of people call them the emigres or emigres, however you want to pronounce them. Emigrate means you're leaving. Immigrate means you're coming in. All right, so the more peasant involvement, more commoners get involved. So, you know, in the countryside, riots also started to occur. People were still angry about the Depression, their old feudal dues and taxes that they had to pay. They used the example of the Bastille and the National Assembly to force their issue, to take matters, in other words, into their own hands. And so from July 20th to August 5th, 1789, there is a phenomenon known as the Great Fear. In the 5 major areas of France, peasant revolts occurred widespread against the feudal lords. They forced the clergy and the landlords to renounce their dues and taxes owed to them. In some cases, they burned tax rolls, basically, essentially eliminating all the records that say that they owe taxes. And and then they also, let's not forget, burned chateaus or the manors, widespread. And again, as you can see in this particular painting, you have chateaus on fire. You got people storming into these chateaus, looting, and so this is where you have the emigres or emigres, and they're getting out of there. This place is nuts. I'm out. All right. So thousands of them started to flee France, as I said earlier. And really, this was a rumor fest. With the agrarian revolts, many were told that the king's supporters. That the king actually supported their actions. So some of them acted because they're saying, hey, Louis says it's okay. And, this lasted for weeks. They went village to village. They spread rumors on the Estates General that the Estates General was going to abolish their taxes anyway and their feudal dues, and that the peasants had to show their support to their public authorities or their public representatives. And in this case, they had to show their support against the aristocratic landholders. So the Great Fear was spawned by rumors and foreign troops, that foreign troops were also going to invade, and that Louis also, you see him on both ends of the rumor spectrum, that Louis and the nobility were orchestrating foreign troops to come in and help restore order. So people joined militias and different committees and vowed to push the revolution forward at all costs. So the National Assembly, on August 4th, 1789, starts to actually pass legislation. The nobles voted to give up feudal rights and privileges. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that's really nice, but I think in many cases they figured they're going to lose them anyway, so they wanted to be on the right side of history rather as opposed to the wrong side. And it occurred in the midst of the Great Fear and the flight of the nobility from France on the night of August 4th. Now, by August 26th, 1789, the National Assembly passed something you need to know, which is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It was kind of modeled after the English Bill of Rights of 1789. It was actually passed 2 years before the American Bill of Rights, but it said that all men are created free and equal, and basically they had the freedom of expression, they should have freedom of religion, taxes should only be raised with common consent, and that the government should secure natural rights to liberty, property, security, and again, it's important to note that this was only for men. What about the rights of women, you might be asking? Well, they did make some gains, okay? And we need to kind of look at both sides of the equation here. Women gained increased rights to divorce. They increased their rights to inherit property and to get child support from fathers of their illegitimate children. But that's about where it ended. The fact was that women at this stage were not considered equal, and women could not vote or hold office. The existing system gave males the advantage in family law, property rights, and of course, education. So what about the ladies? What about the rights of women? It's really important for you all to recognize and give examples of women enthusiastically participating in the early phases of the revolution, because this is imperative because it's key concept 2.14e. And it's also important to recognize that there were brief movements and improvements, as we've already stated, in the legal status of women, but citizenship in the Republic was restricted to that of men. Now again, we've discussed the rights of man and citizen, but what about the ladies? Okay, well, this fact that this stage of the revolution, women were not considered equal, it prompted de Gaulle to respond to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and she came up with the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791. And it applied each of the 17 articles of the Declaration of Man's to women's rights. She wanted equal education. She wanted women's suffrage. She asserted the right to divorce under certain conditions, to control property in marriage, and give women equal access to higher education, civilian careers, and actually allow women to be open to public employment. And this kind of very, very much caught on. And there are 3 other examples that would really be beneficial for you to learn. First, we have Mary Wollstonecraft. Talked about her earlier in the year. Vindication of the Rights of Women, she published in 1792, and she defended de Gaulle's ideas. And she said, civilized women are therefore so weakened by false refinement that respected morals, their condition is much below what it would be were they left in a state nearer to nature. Okay, you can see natural rights here. To women, it may be said, innocent. They mean in a state of childhood, fragile in every sense of the word. They are obliged to look up to man for every comfort. In fear, in girls, instead of being cherished, perhaps created, were treated in the same manner as cowardice boys. We should quickly see women with more dignified aspects. I do not wish them to have power over men, but over themselves. So we kind of see a future call for equal rights. Now, Madame Stael ran a salon and wrote widely read books throughout this particular time period, and she too opposed the subordination of women that the revolution had done so little to change. Now, probably the most important thing here that is in your book was the Women's March to Versailles, which happened early in the morning of October 5th, 1789. Angry women stormed down the streets of Paris and to the Palace of Versailles during the French Revolution with the purpose of obtaining bread by force and demanding that prices go back to the way they were. There were bread shortages, as we mentioned, and many women couldn't feed their families. As we've said, bread was the main diet of the French people at this time in history, and the working class spent half of their wages, sometimes more, just to buy food. However, in August of 1789, prices rose due to the lack of bread being produced and the nationwide inflation. So this march was incited by Jean-Paul Marat. More on him later. But he was a pamphleteer who wanted to push the revolution forward for France's sake, but also for the glory of his own newspaper and his pamphleteering. So 7,000 women demanded that the king redress economic grievances. Women invaded the royal apartments. They just basically broke in, slaughtering bodyguards while searching for Queen Marie Antoinette. They were going to kill her. She got out just in the nick of time. The significance of this event, though, the Women's March to Versailles, is that the king and queen were forced to move to Paris to live at the Tuileries Palace, the royal residence in Paris, and they basically now became prisoners of Paris and prisoners of the Revolution. In addition, the National Assembly also moved to Paris, away from Versailles, and this is where the revolution would become more radical as the Assembly became intimidated by the more radical-minded Parisians. So we have October in 1789 as the National Assembly moved to Paris. We actually see more judicial reforms. There were no parliament or court systems in the provinces. A new system of lower and higher courts were established. They democratized the system of justice. No more torture. The judges that were in place were elected for 6-year terms. They used juries in criminal cases, again, temporarily here, and they made some economic reforms. They upheld laissez-faire doctrine of the day, and they abolished guilds. All occupations were free to open to all classes, and there were no internal tolls or customs. Now, there were also some further religious reforms of, in fact, the Catholic Church. All right, you have something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which in effect secularized. Now, this is going to sound weird. They secularized religion. Okay, more on this later. But they created a national church with 83 bishops and dioceses. This is probably the biggest blunder of the National Assembly. Convents and monasteries were abolished. They got rid of them, because that was important land. We'll talk about the land here in a second. Archbishoprics were abolished. All the clergy was to be paid by the state and elected by all citizens. And this is what I mean by it was secularized. Protestants, Jews, and agnostics could legally take part in the elections based on their citizenship and property qualifications. And the clergy was forced to take a loyalty oath to the new government. They didn't want them to be loyal to the Pope or the old regime. All right, and it should also be noted that the Pope at the time condemned the revolution. So, you see all this and what they did. The Pope declaring this heretical, as heresy, and we have a deep divide. This deeply divided France over the issue of religion. As we know, religion's a very, very powerful moving theme throughout history. The Pope condemned the act as an attempt to subjugate the church. Half of the French priests refused to accept it. They were called, you need to know this, refractory clergy. All right, and they supported the king, they supported the former aristocrats, and in some cases the peasants and urban working class supported these people because, religion's a hard thing to get people to change their philosophy on. Now, back to what I talked about, financial reform. All right, we said that there was no unequal taxation. Taxes were now based on land and profits from trade and industry. Now, there was also something important called the assignat. All right, new paper money, new paper currency established. What did they back it by? Former church property was used to guarantee the value of this paper currency. So church land was being sold to pay off the national debt. This was part of their reform, and a lot of it was actually purchased by the peasants. Okay, so as the text says, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy has often been viewed as a serious blunder on the part of the National Assembly, and again, this is because by arousing opposition to the church, the fact is that people were still very conservative in their religious beliefs and the church and daily life, and it gave the counter-revolutionaries a popular platform on which to stand opposing the French Revolution. It was easier for the revolutionaries to call them radicals and extremists, which, as you'll soon see, was an easy sell. Now, the assignats, you might be thinking, well, that was a pretty good idea, pay off the national debt. And it was an initial stopgap to the economic woes of France and their economic slump. But as you can see in this chart, inflation will continue as the revolution and the war progresses, making this paper currency essentially useless by the time Napoleon comes to town. All right. Now, they did come up with a new constitution, Constitution of 1791. And in this Constitution of 1791, there were 3 branches of government established, an executive, judicial, and legislative. It basically was, and you need to know this, a constitutional monarchy. Lawmaking was given to the legislative branch, which was a unicameral, one house of 745 elected officials, and they would each serve for 2 years. Now, in this new process, the king could veto all but constitutional and financial bills. But 3 times through legislature could override a king's veto. So again, you see checks and balances, shared powers. Montesquieu would be proud. King's budget was limited by the legislative assembly, and France was divided into 83 departments governed by elected local authorities. Now, voting was limited to 25-year-old males, and they had to pay taxes. Holding political offices was limited to what amounted to the middle and upper classes, the wealthier males. And the bourgeoisie seemed to have the power in this new system. And as many nobles, the fact is they weren't elected. So as you can see, it's really not a major reform for the masses. It's really the bourgeoisie kind of supplanting the nobility, and then they rally to protect their own new interests and their own rights, not everyone. So in October of 1791, the Legislative Assembly was created by the Constitution and took over for the National Assembly, which had previously their purpose was creating the government. So we go from the National Assembly to a constitutional monarchy created by the Constitution of 1791, and we need to focus here now on the Legislative Assembly, and you'll see why here in a second. So I apologize, I forgot to put a picture here. So opposition from within. The fact is there was no utopian peace in France now that they embarked on this path of enlightened constitutional monarchy. Why? As we stated at this point, it was more of an upper-class bourgeoisie victory, and many wanted to stop here. There were many people, though, not happy that it turns out, and they wanted to do something different. Who wasn't happy? Well, many of the clerics and commoners alike were really upset at the civil constitution of the clergy changing their religious philosophies. Parisians, clergy, soldiers, and aristocracy were also not happy. However, they had diverse interests, and they wanted them addressed, but it kind of prevented them from rallying together against the bourgeoisie. One big problem here was, as we said, the inflation of the assignats hurt the lower classes. As the cost of living or inflation went up, the value of the currency went down. Political clubs emerged in the spirit of the Enlightenment that had offered more far-reaching and radical solution to the woes of France, both politically and economically. And the most famous of these were the Jacobins, and they were called this because they occupied the former Jacobin convent in Paris. Now, these groups spread throughout the provinces in France as discussion groups. They emerged as a veritable political force as they joined together by 1791, and their headquarters became the Paris Jacobin convent that I just mentioned. The Jacobins included the societal elite, artisans, and tradespeople. So it was a pretty diverse group. All right. Now, those political clubs, as they emerged, that offered these more far-reaching and radical solution, they were basically moderate at first in their approach, however, not for long. In Paris, the more radical groups began to discuss the perpetuation of the French Revolution. These people included Jean-Paul Marat, Danton, and Robespierre. All right, they formed the core. You need to know this is like the great triumvirate in the French Revolution. They formed the core of the famous, most radical group of the Jacobins, and they wanted to end the monarchy and extend the revolution again at all costs. So, here's a picture I should have put in here. They held their meetings here in the Jacobin monastery, and again, they started as a debating society, very middle class oriented, and eventually they're going to lead to the conquest of King Louis XVI. So again, another example of opposition from within is Louis XVI himself. He tries to escape France in June of 1791 to avoid approving this Constitution of 1791 and raise a counter-revolutionary army with émigré noblemen and seek the help of foreign monarchs. He was captured, and the king and queen, again, became prisoners of the Parisian mobs. Louis was forced to accept the Constitution. Again, this is the flight to Varennes. Here's Paris. He gets caught just almost got away with it when an innkeeper recognized him as the king. So it turns out this could have been one of the worst things that Louis could have done. And at this point of the revolution, most people were genuinely excited about the constitutional monarchy and moving forward, with Louis being part of it. However, Louis at this point had undercut the revolution. He almost succeeded, in ending it before he was recognized by that innkeeper. So initially, as he was captured and brought back to Paris, many moderates who didn't like the radicals calling for a republic, an end to the monarchy, acted as though the king was kidnapped. He really didn't do it. However, the radicals made sure that this event was highly publicized. As we said, people like Jean-Paul Marat had newspaper access, and they wrote stories and made sure everybody knew about it. Now, after the king was brought back to Paris, he did make nice, and he actually seemed to be playing the part of a good constitutional monarch. However, it was foreign invention, or the opposition from abroad, that actually plays, this is the opposition from abroad, that plays into the hands of the radicals, and ultimately brought about the doom of Louis XVI. Austria and Prussia issue warnings to France, as the crown and the monarchy is basically prisoner of the Paris mobs. They issue something called the Declaration of Pillnitz in August 27th of 1791 because they fear the spread of a revolution. They're thinking, hey, if this could happen in France, man, this could happen in our own neck of the woods. We need to stop this. The other thing you need to know is Marie Antoinette is the sister of Leopold of Austria. So, you know, they got that family feud, or not a family feud, but, you know, I got to protect my sister thing going on. Both reactionaries and revolutionaries favored an international war as a means to further their own cause. You might think, that is nuts. No, well, let's look at this. Reactionaries, again, the people that kind of want to go back to the way it was, thought an invasion and a preoccupation with a war would cool down the radicals a little bit, and they thought they'd probably lose anyway. And as many of the French officers and emigres were already out of there, so the French army, military, was probably in chaos. So they thought, hey, if we fight this war, we lose, the status quo would be restored. Yay us. The revolutionaries, on the other hand, hoped that the war and the threat of invasion would consolidate the revolution at home. They really felt that it had sputtered and people were complacent. So they envisioned spreading this revolution through fighting these other powers to all of Europe. Now, Louis XVI approaches the Legislative Assembly with a declaration of war, and they almost unanimously support it. So you have the international conflict that begins. And initially, France got their butts kicked. Parisians feared occupation by Austria and Prussia. The Legislative Assembly calls for 20,000 National Guardsmen from the provinces to defend Paris. One group from Marseille arrived singing a war song known as the Marseillaise. Now it is the French national anthem. So as fear of defeat grew, many believed the royals and even the Legislative Assembly were betraying France. French radicals in Paris organized mob attacks on the royal palace at Tuileries, as you can see here, live action footage. And the Legislative Assembly, they asked them to take the king hostage. The king now became a scapegoat. People believed that the king was betraying them and giving out secrets to the foreign opponents, in this case Prussia and Austria. They demanded a national convention. Again, they're calling for a new, if you will, constitution. They're saying the 1791 constitution that established a constitutional monarchy, it's not working. We need to have another convention, and we want a government based on universal male suffrage to decide the future government and the problems of France. And again, this is triggered by, in part, publication in Paris of August 3rd, the Brunswick Manifesto. You need to know that. Issued by the Duke of Brunswick, commander of the Allied Austrian and Prussian troops, which says, nothing will happen to the French people if the king is not harmed. And this, to them, confirmed popular suspicions concerning that the king was in cahoots with the Austrians and with the Prussians. Now, the sans-culottes, talk about them in a second, were among the most radical people wanting to push this new government forward. So the Legislative Assembly surrenders powers to these radicals, which is known as also the Paris Commune. You need to know the Paris Commune. And, again, the Paris Commune is calling for a new national convention to draw up this new constitution. We're about to get crazy here. All right? So, what does this, why does this phase become more radical? Because the Legislative Assembly suspends that constitutional monarchy, and a new constitutional convention that they're calling for is called. So again, this new government is going to be obviously one without a king. It was going to be one based on universal male suffrage. So power passes from the moderates in the Legislative Assembly now to the Paris Commune, who were controlled by the sans-culottes. All right. Again, why are they called the sans-culottes? It means without breeches. All right. It doesn't mean they ran around naked without pants. what they did was they refused to wear the old knee breeches of the nobility. They wore commoners' pants as a sign of equality. Now, again, for those of you who are fans of U.S. history, the first president to do this was, in fact, the third president, T.J. Thomas Jefferson. Dude wore pants. And again, that was a big deal back then. So these revolutionaries, remember, he hung out in Paris for a while, Treaty of Paris, during the Revolutionary War. Anyway, take a push. That'll make more sense. So these revolutionaries started calling and using Rousseau's slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And they were running the show, and it became a hell of a show, let's face it. Let's review it with the approach, with an approach if found while researching. Causes, meet. Remember the acronym. You know I'm big on acronyms. I found this the other day. The causes of the French Revolution can be remembered as meat. I also like hamburgers. So if you remember our hamburger method of writing, this fits right in with it. So you have the M for monarchy, right? Louis XVI, King of France, his Queen Marie Antoinette. They had two main problems. He wasn't a good leader. He wasn't good at making decisions. He preferred to eat and drink. Not a bad idea if you're the king, not a bad idea if you're not the king, but he wanted to do that instead of dealing with his country's problems. And they spent a lot of the government's money on their expensive lifestyle, their huge palace, fancy clothes, and let's not forget Marie Antoinette's huge, like 3-foot hair weave, whatever that thing was. So they became to hate Marie. E, Enlightenment ideas, social contract, natural rights. Got it? Get it? Good. A, American Revolution. Enough about that. We've talked about that. And then T, taxes, taxes, taxes. All right. So there's another thing if you have an essay on this to remember. So this concludes episode 3. Sorry it took so long, but it probably still is shorter than you reading, or hopefully this supplements what you've read. And any questions, feel free to email me at sig@kosd.org, or get in touch with me through Google Classroom, or in fact. Ask me in class. Hey, thanks for listening.